Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Teddy Downey at the Capital Forum. I've got some remarks here, and I'm going to introduce Ambassador Tai in a minute, but I wanted to, for the people who don't know about the Capital Forum, wanted to give you a brief explanation of our company and what we're trying to do here as we continue to build out our trade coverage. We got started 13 years ago with the vision to provide really in-depth reporting, investigative reporting about competition policy. And we started off with antitrust as our main focus. And the reason for that was we thought that, A, there wasn't robust media coverage of that area of law, and there was a sense of a lack of accountability by the people who made and enforced those laws. And we thought there was obviously a business opportunity to both investigate antitrust issues in an in-depth way, hold powerful people accountable, both in business and in government, and to explain how these mergers and monopolies affect society more broadly. And we started with a very small team of people, and now 13 years later, we've got roughly 50 employees in the U.S., Europe, China, and I think it's pretty safe to say we are the well-understood premium trade publication on antitrust, for sure. And we have made a conscious effort to now take that type of expertise, that interest in accountability and investigative work, into trade policy. And I think we see the same things in trade that we saw in antitrust. We saw people very comfortable with the status quo way of doing things, even as there were clear problems in society, and a lack of openness to new ideas in a lot of this community that I've seen so far. And so, the Capital Forum is going to be a place not only to do that investigative reporting, not only to hold people accountable, but also to encourage dialogue, encourage new ideas, encourage challenge to the status quo way of thinking about things. And I'd like to introduce Ambassador Katherine Tai, who I have gotten to know over the past few years. And I think the thing to me that stands out to me about her is that it really takes a lot of courage to challenge the status quo. It really takes a lot of courage to push ahead with policies that some people in your own party don't like, powerful interests don't like. It is hard to stick with a policy that is new and that you want to focus on, bringing up middle class people, because they don't have a lot of say. They don't have a lot of power in Washington. I've spent my whole life here. Parents were in government, and I'm pretty secure in saying that you don't get rewarded really politically for standing up for the middle class. So I'm super excited that Ambassador Tai is going to kick things off for us on our first annual Trade and Competition Policy Forum. And she has served as the U.S. Trade Representative, where she advanced a worker-centric approach to global economic engagement, helped guide the negotiation and implementation of the USMCA. Her career in public service also includes many years shaping U.S. trade law and enforcement, from her leadership on the House Ways and Means Committee to her work on China trade enforcement at the Office of the USTR. And she's been a really important partner in our newsroom over the years, joining us for previous events and podcast conversations that have helped us really understand how a lot of these issues, complex issues, really play out. And we're honored to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Katherine Tai.
bit taller than I am. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you today. And I want to begin by thanking Teddy and the whole Capital Forum team for all that you have done to bring this conversation together over the course of today and all that you do every day. In an era where journalism is facing enormous challenges, the Capital Forum continues to do the kind of work that is so essential to getting our markets to function the way that they are supposed to. And at this point, it's obvious to everyone that the international marketplace is undergoing significant and turbulent changes. So the Capital Forum has wisely added trade to its portfolio of issues. The agenda for today is excellent, I have to say, and I'm talking about everything that comes after me, but I also want to say thank you very much for having me and allowing me to kick off your day's worth of activities. It has been almost a year since I left my office just across the White House grounds at the Winder Building. And I think it's fair to say a lot has happened since then. We've seen tariffs because of fentanyl. We've seen tariffs because of migration, tariffs because of the trade deficit, tariffs because of law enforcement, tariffs because of sanctions. And we've also seen lawsuits challenging those tariffs. We've also seen a posture with our allies that is very different than the one that had been in place on January 19th of this year. For a time, it seemed as though we, the United States, were withdrawing our security guarantee for NATO partners, and our allies in Asia are also nervous about our commitments there. What's happening in our own hemisphere is, of course, in the press every day as well. And it would be easy to look at the change we've seen in the last year as a big break with the order that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War. And in some respects, it is. But we must also understand that parts of that old order, especially the trade parts, were under pressure and duress long before this year. While I'm someone steeped in trade policy, these days it is clear to me that everything is connected. So I think it makes sense for us to look to the great financial crisis in 2008 as the beginning of the end of this most recent previous order, the end of the assumption that the world is flat and that borders don't matter. We saw that the rapid movement of capital around the world, coupled with a, shall we say, light touch approach to regulation, led to the kind of economic implosion in 2008 that we hadn't seen since 1929. It produced the same anger among working people that we saw in the Great Depression. To them, the whole system had been rigged by elites for elites. Our response to the 2008 crisis also reinforced the feeling that the system is rigged. Because look at what we did. We bailed out the bigs. We bailed out the banks. And what did the banks do? Bankers went right back to giving themselves big bonuses, all while we did far too little for those who lost their jobs or had their homes foreclosed on. Many of those communities had already been devastated by NAFTA and the China shock. The Great Recession hit those communities as if the third in a succession of tidal waves. In trade, that's what we tend to miss. We fail to appreciate that trade policy is not isolated from the other parts of our economic policy and our domestic economic policy. In the case of the free trade policy of the last 30 years, it was part of an overarching economic policy, an economic ideology, if you will, that ended up fraying the very fabric of our democracy. Like in antitrust, a Capital Forum specialty area, trade policy was governed by the Chicago School philosophy of letting markets do their thing. And in that universe, government is the problem, not the solution. Well, those markets ended up taking down the global economy in 2008, just as they did in 1929. More than that, though, we need to understand a second important consequence of the financial crisis for trade policy, and that is what China took away from it. For all of the efforts made by the global economic establishment, including and perhaps especially the United States, in urging the PRC to make market-oriented trade and capital liberalizing reforms, the great financial crisis directly undermined the establishment's moral and intellectual authority. For the PRC, especially under the new leadership of Xi Jinping that began in 2012, it decided to pursue its own economic vision, doubling down on what we have come to refer as the PRC's system of state capitalism. And what have we seen since? The policies that we now recognize as leading to chronic excess production and global market dominance, first in steel, aluminum, and glass, and now in clean technologies, including electric vehicles. Even then, here at home, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, where workers have continued to see wages stagnate, we decided that the solution was to negotiate more old-school FTAs. We ramped up negotiations in initiatives like the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, the TPP for Europe. The popular backlash was swift and severe, and this is all a part of our history now. What we saw as a result was that in 2016, Donald Trump was able to barnstorm the country, tapping into this deep vein of grievance. We need to be clear, though. While Trump may have been the most high-profile spokesman for this grievance, the critique wasn't original to him. In fact, many Democrats, especially those from the industrial Midwest, had been banging the drum for years that this version of globalization was leaving workers and working people desperately behind. But the establishment, on both sides of the aisle, ignored these voices. Trump became president in 2017 and began to execute his version of change. He threatened to pull out of NAFTA and started imposing tariffs on aluminum and steel, as well as a wide range of tariffs on goods from China. His argument was a simple one. The system was fundamentally unfair. And that theme of unfairness resonated with a lot of working Americans who had experienced that unfairness themselves. That was already a lot of change. And then in 2020, we know what happened. The pandemic hit. The first Trump administration had already rejected the view that the world is flat. But the pandemic supply shocks proved to be an exclamation point, a lethal exclamation point, that borders matter. In the early part of 2022, Russia decided to invade Ukraine, proving that supply shocks can be man-made or driven by Mother Nature. We saw then in very real terms how the market, left to its own devices, led us to supply chain dependencies so severe that we literally did not have access to basic goods like masks, personal protective equipment, and ventilators. For Europeans, the energy shocks from the Russian invasion of Ukraine should have been a wake-up call. Interdependence has risks. And this is a point I'll come back to, but one of the most important lessons from those supply chain shocks is that they are inflationary. Because of the pandemic, supply chains became kitchen table topic for everyone. The recognition that the old free trade era had major defects has become a mainstream view. That said, it's one thing to know an era is over. It's quite another to build something in its place. Fixing the problems associated with decades of Washington consensus policy has proved to be more than the work of just 4 years. It turns out that it's a lot easier to offshore supply chains than it is to reshore or simply to redesign them. I understand the focus on tariffs right now. We have a president who likes to use them to address, it seems, whatever problem he is focused on at a given moment in time. When people are feeling already squeezed, putting tariffs on things that we don't make here, on goods coming from islands that are only populated by penguins, made it easy to attack the whole premise of using tariffs at all. And in the meantime, we continue to have a cost of living crisis that Zoran Mamdani most recently has made the centerpiece of his winning campaign. But we have to confront the reality that the way we went about tariff cuts over the past 30 years is exactly what led us to the supply chain concentration problem that was itself inflationary and which we are still struggling with and still need to fix. You are not going to be able to solve for that problem without having tariffs be a part of your toolkit. Take that from someone who has worked in trade policy for 20 years, including 4 years as your U.S. trade representative. Tariffs can't be the only tool in your toolkit, but tariffs do have their uses. Even our allies know that because for all their talk of being free traders, most if not all of our allies have higher bound tariff rates under WTO rules than we do. More importantly, though, we need to have a more comprehensive approach to affordability than being lectured by free trade fundamentalists about cheap stuff. If your wages have stagnated for the past 3 decades because we pursued a free trade policy that let multinational corporations bust unions and offshore jobs, then that cheap stuff has turned out to be dearly expensive indeed. And this is exactly the dynamic that we see on the debate over de minimis. And I know there's a panel on de minimis later today, but let me just say that the flood of cheap imports that are impossibly cheap is bad for domestic producers and bad for brick and mortar retailers. It's bad for the workers who make those cheap goods because their working conditions are often reprehensible. And it's bad for consumers when legalized smuggling essentially lets exporters evade basic health and safety laws and standards. I know that there are many small businesses that relied on de minimis and that they have suffered significant damage because of the sudden closing of the loophole. Let me just say this. Just as it seems clear that the answer can't be to keep allowing potentially toxic stuff into our country and to keep driving domestic producers under, it also seems clear that our trade and associated policies need to be designed to set up all of our stakeholders, large and small, for success and longevity. So beware the anti-tariff people who might be glomming onto Mayor-elect Mamdani's affordability agenda today. They're the same people who push the policies that created the race to the bottom trade regime, that created these supply chain headaches in the first place. I spent some time this morning going into some history here, and I want to thank you for indulging me. I was a history major in college, and today, more than ever, I am convinced that we need to be aware of our history. Because during this neoliberal era, we were told that trade was about economic theory, and we were told that economic theory operates like the laws of physics. If you take down all your barriers, your population will necessarily be better off, and you will necessarily get efficient and desirable outcomes. We have experienced, however, all too painfully, what a mismatch there is between that economic theory and reality. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not dismissing economics wholesale or economic theory. They have their place. It can inform your policy choices, but it shouldn't dictate your policy choices. We are learning right now to get back to political economy and context. That's something that the New Dealers understood, something that the people who designed and invested in the Bretton Woods system understood. And we are today relearning some of the most important lessons that they learned because they had seen the consequences of economic governance by elites, for elites only. Just as the Bretton Woods negotiators realized that we were not going back to the gold standard that was the foundation of 19th century trade flows, So we must realize today that we're not going back to the neoliberal trade order. Even Adam Posen, head of the Peterson Institute, what has been the temple of free trade, has acknowledged that neoliberal trade policy missed the mark. So the question today isn't how do we go back, but instead, how do we go forward? And that's why this conference is important and why I'm so pleased to be kicking it off. When I look at the agenda, I see how it highlights the issue that is core to how we build a new version of globalization. On what basis are nations competing in the global economy? Because it's clear, now looking back with the benefit of hindsight, neoliberal trade is trickle-down trade. Benefit the biggest corporations, and those benefits will trickle down and be redistributed to the middle and to the people through the operation of some kind of magical economic gravity. When it turns out that that redistribution doesn't happen by magic, it requires policy and intention. Just ask the folks who engineered the greatest redistribution of wealth upwards that we've seen in several generations earlier this year. As a result of what we've gone through, inequality in the United States and in many other countries around the world has widened, something that the per capita GDP metrics on nationwide and worldwide scales don't capture. The old system incentivized trade and investment based not on the natural competitive advantage of Ricardo's model, but on manufactured comparative advantages. Comparative advantage grounded in who's best at putting downward pressure on cost structures. In that world, workers and the environment are a cost that need to be shrunk. And in that kind of incentive system, what do we get? We get offshoring to places that don't let their workers unionize, or who don't have or don't bother to enforce environmental protections, or all of the above. This incentive structure is a big part of the reason we ended up with the concentrated supply chains in the PRC, where cost structures, whether on labor, the environment, subsidies, or a devalued currency, have been used to achieve global market dominance. A lot of the oxygen right now is taken up with the tariffs, and understandably so. And it's not clear what those tariffs are for on any given day. Is it revenue? Is it leverage? Is it reshoring? Is it all of the above or some of the above in combination? I guess it depends on the day. But all of the focus on tariffs really risks ignoring some of the other trade policies that are equally consequential, if less sexy. Take note that the Chamber of Commerce isn't even suing over the IEEPA tariffs. It seems to me that our multinationals' attention today is focused elsewhere on what they're calling non-tariff barriers. What are non-tariff trade barriers? They are laws, regulations, government actions that might be designed to protect the public, whether when it comes to food safety, product safety, animal welfare. The same thinking that leads to the push to deregulate here at home seems today to be an active part of our trade negotiations. Take a look at what's happening with our tech companies in Europe, for example. There is a real push to get Europe to back off its digital governance regime. Our digital companies aren't the only monopolists benefiting from current trade policy. Take note, we're also pushing the UK to raise prices on their pharmaceutical products. And think about that. The UK today has fiscal constraints it's trying to solve for, and the United States is using its tariff leverage to push the UK to spend more of its limited funds on drugs. And who benefits from that? Companies that made record profits during the pandemic and then spent a good chunk of those profits on share buybacks. That's a lot like what we used to do under the neoliberal system. Take our biggest companies' wish lists and use our considerable leverage as the United States economy to line their pockets. In fact, that's not just neoliberal trade policy. That's Gilded Age trade policy. It's colonial trade policy. Every one of those systems was about benefiting the haves on the backs of the have-nots. Every one of those systems was about building and maintaining dominance. And eventually, those systems are crushed under the weight of the very inequality that they aggravate. So what does this mean for us today? There isn't a version of globalization on the shelf that we can implement tomorrow and say, great, we got that sorted out. We actually have to roll up our sleeves and do the work. USMCA is a good place to start. I see that it's the first panel today. You should know, though, that USMCA is your standard 34-chapter free trade agreement covering tariffs, digital trade, intellectual property, agriculture, but also labor and the environment. And it's easy to focus on the question of how can you tweak each of these chapters to think about the next incremental improvement to that generation of trade agreements. It is vitally important to do a proper review of the USMCA for all kinds of reasons, but I also think that there's a risk that people will lose the forest for the trees. USMCA is a trade agreement that includes important innovations for workers, especially when it comes to the rapid response mechanism. But just know that USMCA, as a renewal of the original NAFTA, is still, at its heart, a creature of the neoliberal era. Most of the supply chains that have been shaped by USMCA reflect neoliberal policies. That is, maximizing the opportunity for the cheapest possible sourcing, no matter how that cheapness is achieved. Take a look at the digital trade chapter. It was created before the explosion of ChatGPT into our collective public consciousness, before our awareness that data is the lifeblood of AI and our modern digitally enabled economy and society. Is our ambition to tinker with a chapter written by and for the tech oligarchs? Or do we now, in 2025 and 2026, face the much bigger challenge of figuring out how democratic governments can stand up to companies that are in many ways, today, more powerful than government itself? It's another point of similarity with the colonial era, the British East India Company, the Gilded Age, and our own robber barons. None of us has all the answers, but conferences like this one are an important place to kick off and to perpetuate this much-needed discussion of reinvention. Before we left office in January, we pushed out 3 sets of documents that we viewed as moving the conversation forward. We published a series of policy papers on adapting trade policy for supply chain resilience. I think that it is still available on the USTR website, at least it was earlier this morning. It includes both a diagnostic and the beginnings of a prescription for how to design supply chains using trade policy, cooperative trade policy, to counter the drivers of the supply chain concentration that we are all suffering from today. We also published a set of 5 model texts. These texts were designed to advance a vision of trade that's grounded in fair competition. The texts cover economic inclusion, competition, non-market economies, standards, and public enterprises. Unlike the supply chain papers, these texts are a little bit harder to find online, but you can still find them if you're persistent. We also published an article in Foreign Affairs at the beginning of this year to recapture the original version for trade of the founders of the multilateral trading system and the way that that vision still resonates today. Before I close, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about volatility. Now, the Capital Forum understands markets, and there are market participants who are actually very good at making money off of volatility. I know this because I watch TV, and I've been watching industry. So I know for a fact that volatility isn't bad for everyone. It can be very good for some people. But when it comes to trade policy, we usually hear that markets want certainty and predictability, Markets are looking for confidence, not volatility. And that desire for certainty is one of the reasons that changing trade policy has been such a daunting task. Trade associations, businesses, the foreign policy community, the economic establishment, academia, these are constituencies who have tended to prize perpetuation of the status quo because change creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is destabilizing, uncertainty is bad. It's important to recognize, though, that refusing to change can also be destabilizing, especially when everything is changing around you anyway. If you have a trade policy that is so harmful to working families that it undermines confidence in democracy itself, then continuing to pursue that trade policy is destabilizing. I was reflecting just the other day that I litigated many years ago a dispute at the WTO, including with some folks who are here in the room today, over China's rare earths policy. That was more than a decade ago. What did we do after that case, which we won, by the way, to protect ourselves against these types of predatory policies of cornering the market in strategic industries? Well, look how vulnerable we still are on that same issue of rare earths today. Because the fact of the matter is, despite everything that we knew, we didn't adapt, and we haven't changed. And we are worse off for it today. It's actually a little bit ironic that those with nostalgia for the neoliberal era's policies and the confidence and comfort that came with those policies are also, sometimes today, rallying around the critique that, quote, nostalgia is not a strategy. The status quo ante of 2005 and 2015 is also bygone. Let's be clear about everybody who is suffering from nostalgia. Today, what we need is to have the kind of courage and vision that our Bretton Woods forefathers had. They did not think small, my friends. They didn't tinker at the edges. What they did do was envision a new way of governing the global economy, one that would promote peace and prosperity, not through blind faith in markets or a superficial understanding of interdependence, but by making sure that markets work for those that really matter, which is that markets work for people. And that means all of us, whether it's in Michigan or in Ohio or France or Canada or Mexico or South Africa or even China. So I will conclude with this. As we once again confront geopolitical instability, a rise in authoritarianism, and widening inequality, let us be guided toward a new future not by the stale dictates of textbooks or models or very limited ideologies, it turns out, but let us be guided and move forward by understanding, adapting, and applying the lessons of our history, our own lived experience, and our values, and applying those to the reality that is staring us in the face every single day. Thank you very much, Teddy.
We got time for one question from the audience. Any questions?
Just one special question. It's for the holidays.
That's a great question.
Teddy, do you have a question?
I always have.
Okay.
Do you have any comment about how you see the role of the dollar in this?
Yes, indeed. How monetary policy fits into trade policy is a really important question. And it's one of those things where a lot of trade policy folks operate in the trade policy lane, and then whenever monetary policy question comes up, right, my first instinct is to say, talk to Treasury. But my point about everything being connected is that everything is connected, and we should get comfortable pushing ourselves out of our lanes. This current administration, the second Trump administration, does see monetary policy and trade policy as deeply interconnected in their vision of remaking the American economy and the role of the American economy in the world economy. I think that that is an invitation that all of us, wherever we sit in our areas of expertise and in terms of our professions, that is an invitation that we must not turn down. So this is all to say you are asking the right question. And I think that it needs to be a part of the conversation and a part of the solution. And my challenge for everybody in the room today and everybody who will be participating is, in view of the need for a revamping and a reforming of our trade policies as part of a larger economic policy reset, what is the monetary policy that has to work together with this trade policy to deliver results for a truly inclusive prosperity that the world needs, but America needs today? And so is my way of saying, I don't have the answer for you today. It is something that I and some of my colleagues are thinking very deeply on. But I welcome that question, and I hope maybe next year when you convene this study, you'll invite me back and we can continue and put our ideas on the table.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.